Hi everyone, this is going to be our fifth mini lecture for our Autonomic Nervous System chapter. In this mini lecture we are going to start looking into the parasympathetic division of the nervous system so that we can then wrap up by sort of comparing or looking at the relationship between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. One of the first things that you may notice about the parasympathetic division, at least compared to the sympathetic division, is sort of where these fibers are arising from. So in this case, with the parasympathetic division, we're going to see origination in the brainstem, as well as from the sacral region of the spinal cord. So the neurosoma of our preganglionic fibers in this case are going to be located either in the midbrain, the pons, or the medulla, or the sacral region in S2 through S4. So again, that's the neurosoma of the preganglionic fibers are going to be located in the brainstem, so in the midbrain, the pons, or the medulla, or in the sacral region of the spinal cord, S2 through S4. One of the major differences that, again, we see between parasympathetic and sympathetic, and I did mention this before, was what the relationship or sort of how the preganglionic to postganglionic fibers appear. In the parasympathetic nervous system, we see really long preganglionic fibers and then fairly short postganglionic fibers. And the reason that we have this distinction is that these preganglionic neurons don't actually synapse or terminate until we are in a ganglia that is located really close to the target organ. So if we follow any one of these sort of green lines, which would be a axon neuron coming from the parasympathetic division, we'll see that they go almost all the way to their target organ, and then they're going to enter ganglia, synapse there, and our postganglionic fiber is shown here in red, much shorter. So the exact opposite of what we see in the sympathetic division, where we have fairly short preganglionic fibers and very long postganglionic fibers. We also know that in the parasympathetic division, we have less neural divergence. So remember, neural divergence would be where we have one preganglionic fiber that is going to synapse with multiple postganglionic fibers. We do see that to sort of a limited extent in the parasympathetic nervous system, but not to the extent that we see in the sympathetic division. And what that does is it actually makes stimulation by the parasympathetic division more selective than the sympathetic. So the sympathetic is going to send one message down a preganglionic neuron, and that message is going to end up going down 10 to 20 postganglionic fibers. It can have a very widespread effect. That's not selective stimulation of a target. The parasympathetic is much more selective than that. We don't get that divergence, and so a message going down a parasympathetic fiber is going to make it to a very specific sort of endpoint. So this is a list of sort of the pathways that the parasympathetic nervous system is going to take. We have 4 of our cranial nerves involved, and then again the spinal cord and sacral region. I don't want to delve too deep in all the divisions here. This is sort of the same thing that we looked at with the sympathetic. This time, instead of coming out of our thoracic and lumbar regions, we can see that we're coming out of the brainstem or the sacral regions. Those are our points of origin. In the brainstem, we're going to come out cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. And so if you don't remember what those are yet, we have oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus are going to be those nerves. The oculomotor is going to carry parasympathetic innervation to the pupil. We're going to see the facial carrying parasympathetic innervation to tear ducts, salivary glands, and nasal glands, and the glossopharyngeal is involved in salivation, so to the salivary gland. The vagus nerve is going to be sort of the biggest contributor to parasympathetic innervation. 90% of all parasympathetic preganglionic fibers are going to originate in the vagus nerve. So the preganglionic fibers here actually form three major networks. Those networks are going to be cardiac, so it's going to go to the heart, pulmonary to the lungs and the bronchi, and then esophageal for swallowing. We also have what's called the vagal trunk. The vagal trunk is going to send innervation to the abdominal aortic plexus, which we sort of talked about with the sympathetic. We have a similar situation here with parasympathetic. And so we end up getting to target organs like the liver, the pancreas, the stomach, the small intestine, the kidney, the ureter, the colon. And so again, we can sort of follow these. Here's cranial nerve 3. We can see there's its ganglion, again, closer to the target organ than to the brainstem. It's called the ciliary ganglion, and we are going to send innervation to the pupil of the eye. Cranial nerve 7, so we have our facial nerve here. Again, we have a couple of ganglia here, but going to our lacrimal gland, which is going to produce tears, the mucous membrane of the nose and palate, and then the submaxillary and sublingual salivary glands. Cranial nerve 9 is going to send innervation to, again, the mucous membrane as well as the parotid gland, which is one of the salivary glands. We can see just by looking at where the cranial nerve goes, where cranial nerve 10 or the vagus nerve goes, we get messages to the heart, to various parts of the respiratory system, so larynx, trachea, and bronchi, to much of the digestive system, so the esophagus and the stomach, abdominal blood vessels, liver and bile ducts, that's an accessory organ of digestion, the pancreas, the adrenal glands, the small intestine, and parts of the large intestine, right? And so much of this is going to be coming off of that abdominal aortic plexus. Off of the sacral region of the spinal cord, we don't have nearly as much. This is a very small region, and so there's not a lot of innervation coming from here. But we do get pelvic splanchnic nerves, which go to the inferior hypogastric plexus, which will then send nerves to target organs in the rectum, the colon, the bladder, and the reproductive organs. So let me say that again because that was kind of a mouthful. In this region, we get pelvic splanchnic nerves. So if you don't remember what splanchnic nerves are, go back to the last lecture where I mumbled through that. But we have these nerves that pass through, straight through ganglia and then head towards their target organ. They go to what's called the inferior hypogastric plexus, which then is going to sort of spread that message towards different targets. So we get the colon, the rectum, the bladder, reproductive organs. Now I'm going to switch gears kind of entirely here into what's called the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is part of the digestive system, and what's interesting here is the digestive system actually pretty much has its own nervous network. It does not arise from the central nervous system. So I'm going to say that again. The enteric nervous system is part of the digestive system, and what's unique about this particular nervous system is that it does not arise from the central nervous system. It is only found in the digestive system, and it innervates both the smooth muscles and glands in this particular region. So in the digestive tract, we have 100 million or so neurons located in the walls. This is an image that you'll become more familiar with next semester as you talk about the digestive system, but we have sort of multiple layers here that make up the walls of the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal tract, and maybe wedged is the wrong word, in between some of these layers, we have these networks of neurons. And so we have one that's called the submucosal plexus in here, and then the other is called the myenteric plexus, which is located between two different layers. The point is that this particular nervous system is mostly independent of the central nervous system, and it is going to regulate motility, secretion, and reflexes of the digestive system. Now, motility and secretion are also regulated by the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, but they're more sort of secondary, or depending on the situation, they are involved in different ways. So just a slightly different type of nervous system that I wanted to point out and have you be at least familiar with, but that we will go more into when we talk about the digestive system as a whole. Okay, and so here's where I'm going to leave us with this little mini lecture. This is a comparison table of sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So where does it originate? Thoracic and lumbar regions for sympathetic, cranial and sacral regions for parasympathetic. Where do we find the ganglia? So in the sympathetic nervous system, we have those ganglia that are longitudinal along either side of the spinal column. And then, excuse me, and then in this parasympathetic, our ganglia are going to be really close to that target organ. The fiber lengths, remember these are opposite of each other, so we have short preganglionic and long postganglionic for sympathetic, because we are going to use these ganglia, paravertebral ganglia, longitudinal to the spinal column, as sort of our first stop for our preganglionic, and then the postganglionic usually arise at that point and head all the way to the target organs. Opposite in the parasympathetic, long preganglionic, they go almost all the way to our target organ or cell, where they'll then synapse in a nearby ganglia, and then short postganglionic. Neural divergence, fairly extensive in sympathetic, minimal in parasympathetic, and then effects on the system, again, associated with the fact that we have neural divergence in some ways, is we have widespread effects of sympathetic and local effects of parasympathetic. Okay, so that is it for this little lecture. I will come back and we will start looking at some of the neurotransmitters and receptors, and then why we have dual innervation and how these systems complement or antagonize each other.